The fog came in off the Pacific every morning that October, rolling over the headlands in slow gray sheets, swallowing the pines one by one until the coastline disappeared entirely. By 9 o'clock it usually burned off, but on the morning of the reading it stayed. It pressed against every window of Cliff House, like something that had been waiting a long time and had finally decided to stop being polite about it. Sloane Callahan sat at the far end of the dining table and said nothing. She had been saying nothing for most of the morning. She'd made coffee before her brothers arrived, poured 3 cups, and left the pot where anyone could reach it. She'd opened the windows in the living room because the house smelled like the industrial lavender cleaner. The new service used the kind that was supposed to smell like lavender, but only smelled like someone trying very hard. She'd straightened the curtains in the front room because one panel hung lower than the other, and it had been bothering her since August and no one else had noticed. Then she'd sat down at the table and folded her hands and waited. Brennan arrived at 9:10, wearing work boots with dress pants and a tape measure clipped to his belt. He was 46 and had his father's jaw and his father's way of walking into a room as though the room had been expecting him. He carried a briefcase which surprised Sloane slightly. Their father had never owned a briefcase in his life. Shepard arrived 12 minutes later with coffee from a drive-through 40 minutes up the coast because he didn't drink what Sloane made. He was 38 and had their father's easy smile and their mother's talent for being in the room without quite being present. He'd driven back from Portland 2 weeks ago when the estate paperwork started, and he'd been managing to look both busy and slightly put upon ever since. They laid out the folders on the table, 3 of them, thick and yellow, one for each of the income-producing properties. Cliff House, the largest right here on the bluff, 4 bedrooms, and a wrap-around porch, and a deck that faced the ocean so directly that in winter storms the salt spray made the glass look like it was weeping. Blue Ridge, a quarter-mile up the road, the one with the bad kitchen drain, and the view that every guest photographed at sunrise. Harrow Cottage, set back in the trees, the smallest, the one that booked last, but kept guests longest once they arrived. 3 yellow folders, the briefcase open on the chair beside Brennan, Shepard's phone face down on the table. And then there was the 4th thing, a manila envelope, thin enough to look empty. It sat beside Brennan's right hand. He didn't introduce it. He didn't look at it. He laid the 3 folders out and began talking about occupancy rates and Q4 projections and the importance of unified management for the brand. Sloane looked at the manila envelope. She knew what it represented before anyone said a word, the way you sometimes know the shape of a thing before it's named. Their father had built 4 properties along this stretch of Oregon coast over 28 years. He talked about all of them constantly, listed their qualities and their problems and their quirks, the way another man might talk about his children. 3 of them were the rentals. The 4th was something else. Their father had called it the Lead Shack. He meant it as a dismissal. Sloane had always thought he meant something more complicated than that, but she'd never said so. Brennan talked for 11 minutes before he paused to check whether anyone had questions. Sloane looked at the envelope one more time. Then she reached across the table and pulled it toward her. Both brothers stopped. Brennan's pen went still over his legal pad. Shepard looked up from the place on the table he'd been studying. The room changed in the way rooms change when someone does something that breaks the expected pattern, that specific quality of silence that arrives not when there's nothing to say, but when there's too much. "I'll take the Clef cabin," Sloane said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That was the thing about 5 years of managing a rental business. At the age of 17, you learned to make your voice do what you needed it to do, regardless of what was happening underneath. Shepard laughed. It was the kind of laugh people produce when they expect you to join them, when the sound is really a question disguised as amusement. Sloane did not join him. Brennan set his pen down carefully. He had their father's habit of treating objects with great deliberateness when he was trying to collect himself. "You can't live there," he said. "I can once the furnace works." "The furnace is not the problem." "What's the problem?" Shepard put his coffee down. He had the good grace to drop the smile before he spoke. "The problem," he said, "is that you'd be trading actual income for a shed with plumbing." "Intermittent plumbing," Brennan added. Sloane looked from one brother to the other. They were both waiting for her to return to herself, to come back from whatever edge she was standing near and rejoin the conversation they'd been planning for 3 weeks. The conversation she noticed they'd been planning for 3 weeks without once inviting her to the table where they planned it. "You keep the rentals," she said. "I'll keep the cabin." What she did not say was this, that she had been the one answering the phone for 5 years when guests called at 11 at night about the thermostat, that she was the one who kept the records in the green binder and the index cards in the wooden box and the vendor contacts in the folder that Brennan had already asked her to email him twice without saying please, that she had driven 40 minutes in a January storm to deliver extra blankets to Harrow Cottage when the heat ran low because the guest had a child and because her father had forgotten to mention the thermostat had a lag when you set it above 68, that she had done all of this while taking 2 online courses and keeping her father's accounts and answering Shepard's questions about the booking platform every time he called, which was every few days, always at the worst possible time. She did not say any of it. She just kept her hands flat on the table and looked at her brothers with an expression that her father would have recognized because he taught her how to make it on the mornings when they sat together at the kitchen table going over the week's bookings, and she would find a problem he hadn't noticed and he would go quiet in that particular way of his just for a moment before he moved on. "What are you trying to prove?" Brennan asked. It was the first question either brother had asked that morning that came anywhere near being honest. It was also the first one that frightened her because Sloane did not yet know the answer. She thought she might know part of it, but the full shape of it was still forming the way the coastline reformed itself every morning once the fog finally decided to leave. The Clef cabin sat 3/10 of a mile from Cliff House, but it was not a 3/10 of a mile walk by any ordinary measure. You left the gravel lot and crossed the back of the property, past the wild rosemary that grew in a thick, unruly hedge along the fence line, past the old equipment shed with the rusted padlock, past the place where the lawn simply ended and the headland began. Then you found the opening in the rock. It was easy to miss if you didn't know it was there, a gap in the sandstone face maybe 2 feet wide at its narrowest, where generations of water and wind had worked a seam open in the cliff. Someone Sloane had always assumed it was the original owner of the land, some stubborn person who lived here 100 years ago and refused to accept that the terrain was trying to tell them something had cut steps into the rock. Rough ones, uneven, the kind of steps that required you to pay attention to every single one. The path ran for roughly 180 meters along the cliff face. On one side of you, the sandstone wall close enough that you kept one hand on it without thinking, the way you kept a hand on the railing of a staircase in the dark. The rock was cold and slightly damp, and smelled of brine and mineral, that particular combination of smells that meant ocean was very close and that the land you were standing on had spent most of its geological history underwater. On the other side of you, nothing. 15 meters below the edge of the path, the base of the cliff was a chaos of black boulders that the Pacific spent every hour of every day rearranging, heaving itself against them, pulling back, heaving again. On a calm day, the sound was rhythmic, almost gentle. On anything other than a calm day, the sound was something else entirely. It was the sound of a force that had never in its existence found any reason to distinguish between the things it destroyed and the things it left alone. The path was 45 centimeters wide at its broadest point. Sloane had walked it before, a few times as a child, holding her father's hand, never looking down. Once at 16, when she'd gone after her father, when he walked out there, angry about something she couldn't remember, and stayed out there a long time. She'd followed him and stood 10 feet back and waited until he was ready to turn around, and he'd looked at her when he did and said without much expression, "You didn't have to come out here." She'd said, "I know." She walked it alone for the first time on the day of the estate meeting after her brothers drove away and the fog had finally, reluctantly begun to lift. The wind had picked up. It came off the water at an angle and pressed against her left side with a steady, insistent pressure like a large hand that couldn't decide whether it was trying to help or hinder. She moved slowly. Her right hand stayed on the rock. She did not look at the drop. She looked at the path immediately in front of her feet, at the worn hollows where decades of footsteps had smoothed the stone, and she thought about the person who had first cut these steps with a chisel or a pickaxe or whatever they'd had available, and she thought about what had possessed them, what view or what privacy or what particular variety of stubbornness had made it seem worth the work. She reached the cabin in just under 10 minutes. It sat wedged into the base of the cleft itself, the gap where the two sandstone walls finally came apart just enough to contain a structure. The cabin was approximately 380 square feet, built from weathered cedar and river stone, and it had been built to fit into the space rather than to take advantage of it. It was low-ceilinged and narrow. Its south wall was the living rock of the cliff. Its north wall was a mix of cedar plank and old mortar that someone had repointed at least twice imperfectly, both times. The whole structure leaned approximately 8 degrees to the north, a tilt you could feel in the floor before you could see it, the way a slightly wrong chair makes itself known before you identify what's wrong. The cabin's east corner, the corner that faced the open water, sat on 3 iron posts that had been driven into the bedrock. Between those posts and the ground below them was a crack in the cliff approximately 4 meters deep, a vertical darkness that you could hear the ocean breathing through at high tide. Sloane stood on the porch, which was not really a porch, but a platform 3 weather-beaten planks wide, and used her phone's flashlight to work the key. The door had swollen in its frame from the moisture. She had to press her shoulder against it. Inside, the smell arrived first. Cold wood and dust and mouse and salt and old paint. The particular combination of smells that means a space has been holding its breath for years. Her phone light moved across the room slowly, the way you move a flashlight when you're not sure what you're going to find. A narrow kitchen against the west wall. A single window above the sink, clouded with salt residue, facing into the cleft. A table that listed to one side. 2 chairs that had been here since before Sloane was born, mismatched, both of them solid in ways that expensive chairs often weren't. Against the far wall, there was the fireplace, small stone with a sheet of plywood over the opening. Her father had covered it years ago after some incident involving birds and the chimney that he described differently every time he told the story. There was a shelf on one wall, empty, still showing the ring marks of cans and bottles that had sat on it for decades and then been removed by someone who never came back to replace them. There was a coat hook by the door with no coats on it. There was a wooden chair near the north window, heavier than the others, with arms that curved down in a way that suggested someone had once cared enough about the design to do something thoughtful with the wood. Sloane set her phone on the table and let the light point at the ceiling for a moment. She stood in the middle of the cabin and breathed. Then she went to the wooden chair and sat down. From there, through the north window, the window that faced the narrow gap between the two cliffs, before they opened out to the ocean, she could see a strip of water, a slice of the Pacific framed by two walls of sandstone, the kind of view that had no practical use whatsoever and was for that reason possibly the most valuable thing on the property. She sat for a long time. 3 days later, she sat across a law firm's conference table from a man named Gerald Oates, who was the estate attorney and who had the precise, quiet manner of someone who had spent 30 years delivering information to people in varying states of shock and had learned that the best you could do was be accurate and clear and leave the tissue box within reach. He read through the standard documents first, the distribution of assets, the operating accounts, the agreement. All three Callahan children had already discussed in rough form, which would transfer the 3 rental properties to Brennan and Shepard as a joint business entity. Then he picked up a second folder. It was thinner. He opened it to a single page and placed it on the table facing Sloane. "This is a separate conveyance document," he said. "Your father executed it 3 years ago. It transfers the property known as the Cleft Cabin and its associated lot to you, Sloane Elaine Callahan, independently of the main estate. This transfer is not contingent on the estate settlement. It is as of your father's death already in effect." Sloane looked at the document. Brennan said, "What? Your father signed this 3 years ago," Gerald said, addressing the room but keeping his eyes on Sloane. "The transfer has been legally recorded. The cabin and its parcel belong to Sloane." "He didn't tell us," Shepard said. "He wasn't required to." "Did he give a reason?" Gerald folded his hands. "The document does not include a statement of intent. That's not unusual. People make these arrangements for many reasons." Sloane was still looking at the page. She read it twice, not because she didn't understand it, but because she was trying to feel the edges of it, trying to understand what it meant that her father had made this decision 3 years ago when she was 19 years old and had never said a word about it to her. 3 years of phone calls and guest records and middle-of-the-night furnace failures and vendor contracts, and somewhere inside all of that, her father had gone to a lawyer and signed a piece of paper and put it in a folder and kept it there. What did you do with that? What was it? Proof that he saw her, or proof that he couldn't bring himself to say what he saw, so he put it on paper instead and hoped she'd figure it out after he was gone. She signed where Gerald indicated. Her hand was steady. She drove home alone. She sat in her car in the driveway for 7 minutes by the clock on the dashboard. Then she went inside and made tea and sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, which is where she'd always gone when she needed to cry and didn't want anyone to see her do it, because the kitchen floor of this house was the one place in her entire life where she could reasonably guarantee no one would look for her. She cried for a long time, not entirely because she missed her father, not entirely because of the cabin, partially because she did not know whether the thing he'd done was a gift or an apology or simply an old man trying to solve a problem he couldn't find the words for, and the not knowing sat on her chest like something physical. When she was done, she washed her face. She made dinner. She did not call her brothers. The week after the meeting had a particular rhythm to it, and the rhythm was this: her brothers called when they needed something, and Sloan answered. Shepard called on Monday about the booking platform. He needed the administrative password for the back-end account, the one that let you access the guest history and the payment records. Sloan had built the account herself at 17, choosing the username and the password and setting up the two-factor authentication with her own phone number, because her father had liked having things set up but had not liked setting things up. She told Shepard the password. He thanked her. He called again Tuesday about the check-in protocol for Blue Ridge. Had the code been changed recently? Yes, Sloan told him. She changed it in September when a guest had accidentally photographed it and posted the photo in a travel group online. She gave him the new code and the backup code and explained that the lockbox sometimes jammed in cold weather and you had to press the panel at an angle before entering the sequence. He wrote it down. He thanked her. Brennan arrived at her house Wednesday evening without calling first. He stood on her porch holding a printed sheet of paper. It was the linen inventory for Cliff House. The new service needs a count, he said. I need to know if this matches what's actually in the house. Sloan looked at the list. It doesn't, she said. The two queens in the front bedroom were sent out for repair in August and came back as one queen and one full. Nobody updated the inventory. How do I update it? There's a binder in the laundry cupboard at Cliff. Dark green, not the lime green one. The lime green one is the seasonal closing protocol. Brennan wrote that down on the back of the inventory sheet. He did not say thank you. He said, what about the mattress protectors? She told him about the mattress protectors. She told him about the spare key situation and the propane tanks for the outdoor heater and the particular issue with the hot water heater at Blue Ridge, which ran cold for 90 seconds after a pressure fluctuation, but was not actually failing. It was just old, and if you told guests about it in advance, they took it as charming rather than problematic. She told him all of it, standing in her own doorway on a Wednesday evening without being asked to. After he left, she stood in the kitchen and looked at the dishes she'd been washing when he knocked. She thought about how quickly she had answered, how completely, how the words had come out already organized, already helpful, already packaged in the form most useful to him, like water from a tap, like something automatic, like something that happened before the decision to do it had been made. She had been doing this for 5 years, and it had never once occurred to her to wonder why it came so easily, because it had always seemed like the obvious thing to do. You knew something. Someone needed to know it. You told them. But standing at her kitchen sink with the water running cold because she'd been at the door too long, she allowed herself a different question. When had anyone last called just to ask how she was doing? Hugh Marsh arrived at the Clef cabin on a Thursday morning wearing a canvas vest with 12 pockets and carrying a bag of equipment that he'd complained about the whole way up the path to no one in particular, since Sloan had let him go first and was 3 steps behind him. Hugh was a large man, broadly built in his mid-60s, with a white beard that he'd never made any particular effort to tame. He was a building inspector by trade, and he had been doing this work for long enough that he no longer bothered to soften his findings with diplomatic language. He simply described what he saw and left it to his clients to decide how they felt about it. His voice carried. This was the word people use. It carried across valleys and through walls and apparently through two opposing faces of sandstone cliff. His older brother had been the same before he retired. Same volume, same tendency to announce his findings as though the building itself needed to hear them. It was apparently a family trait. His niece Faye had broken the pattern entirely, being one of the quietest people Sloane had ever met, which was perhaps why they'd always gotten along. Roof problem, Hugh announced from inside the attic space where he'd been for 4 minutes. 3 of them. You'll want to hear this. I can hear you fine, Sloane called. She was standing in the main room with plaster dust in her hair from when the attic hatch had opened. He came down the step ladder, backward 1 boot at a time, and showed her the photographs on his tablet, flashing loose around the chimney stack, an old patch job that had begun to separate, and a gap near the eastern eave where on very bright mornings you could see a line of pale light that had no business being there. How bad, she asked. Subjective word. Expensive then. Also subjective. He looked at her over the top of his glasses. The flashing needs attention now, before winter. The patch can wait until spring if you seal it correctly in the meantime. The eave damage is old. Animal. Raccoon probably. Nothing living up there now except spiders who have established strong opinions about territory, Sloane added to her list. Hugh moved through the cabin systematically. He found a crack in the furnace heat exchanger, the furnace being a unit so old it had likely survived several presidential administrations without being serviced. He found 2 outlets with reverse polarity. He found evidence of an old leak under the bathroom sink that had dried out years ago but left a ghost of itself in the subfloor, and he found the porch platform's eastern support, which had been resting not on any proper footing but on a stack of flat stones that someone had arranged with what Hugh described as optimism rather than engineering. Good news, Sloane asked. Hugh closed his notebook. Walls are dry, floor joists are sound, the lean is consistent. She's chosen her direction and she's committed to it. Most structures near the water eventually pick a side. He tapped the stone wall with 1 knuckle. This one's been leaning north for decades. Hasn't gotten worse. You can work with a building that's made its decision. He moved to the fireplace and removed 2 screws from the plywood panel her father had installed. Cold air breathed into the room, carrying the smell of wet leaves and deep stone. Your father put this here, Hugh said, after birds came down the chimney. Chimney needs a cap and cleaning. Firebox looks structurally sound. Don't use it until it's been assessed. I wasn't planning to. He made a sound that meant he'd heard that before. He replaced the board and moved to the kitchen. You doing any of the work yourself? Painting, maybe the floors. He glanced at her hands, then at her with the particular expression of someone who has decided not to say what he almost said. I need names, Sloane said, for the work I can't do myself. He listed a roofer, an electrician, a furnace service. He scratched the side of his beard for the smaller jobs. There's a fellow named Devlin Reed, he said, takes on repair work, good hands, reasonable rates. Sloane's pencil stopped. Hugh noticed. He noticed most things, which was presumably why he was good at his job. You know Devlin, he said, not quite a question. I know the name. Hugh looked at her in a way that suggested he knew more than he was saying and had decided to leave the rest of it where it was. He wrote the number down beneath the others. Sloane looked at the last 4 digits. She had not expected to know them, but she did. After Hugh left, after his voice had faded down the path and been replaced again by the sound of the ocean, Sloane stood alone in the cabin kitchen and looked at the number. Devlin Reed. She had been 14 years old. It was a summer morning, and she'd been in the kitchen of Cliff House finishing breakfast. The back window of the kitchen faced the equipment yard, and through it she'd seen her father in the yard with Devlin Reed, who had been working on the deck repair at Blue Ridge. She had seen her father holding a set of rolled papers, blueprints. She understood now, though she hadn't known the word for them at the time, only that they were important enough to be rolled and stored in a tube. She had seen her father walk past Devlin into the equipment shed with the papers under his arm. She had seen the shed door close. She had seen Devlin Reed's face in the moment before the door closed. 3 days later, her father told the family that Devlin Reed had walked off the job, had left a deck project half finished, which had allowed moisture in, which had caused damage, which had cost money. Her father said Devlin had been irresponsible. He said it in the way he said things that he wanted to be done with quickly and finally, as if the speed of the saying could close a door on what he'd left out. Sloane had been 14. She had not had the language for what she'd seen. She'd had only the feeling of it, the heavy, uncomfortable awareness that two things were true at the same time, and that the second thing was being buried by the first, and that she was the only one who knew both. And she had stayed quiet because she was 14, and because her father was her father, and because making that kind of accusation in her family in that particular house with its particular silences would have required a courage she hadn't yet grown into. Maybe a courage she still wasn't sure she'd grown into. But Devlin Reed was in her hand as a phone number now, and the cabin behind her was legally finally hers. She folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket. She walked back along the path with one hand on the rock, the ocean 15 meters below, the wind coming in at its angle. The week shaped itself into a particular kind of endurance. Brennan called on Friday about the guest turnover at Cliff House. The new regional cleaning service had missed 2 items on the departure checklist, and he'd found a complaint in the review queue from a guest who'd been there the week before. He wanted to know where the spare vacuum filters were kept. Second shelf equipment closet, Sloane told him. Left side blue bag. He thanked her and hung up. Shepard emailed about the Hartley reservation. The Hartleys were a couple in their early 70s who had been coming to Cliff House for 12 consecutive years. They booked the same weeks, always in late fall. They had specific requirements: a firm pillow for Mr. Hartley's neck, a particular luggage rack that lived under the back bedroom bed, early check-in when available. Sloane had been handling their booking personally since she was 17. She knew their car, their anniversary, and the year Mr. Hartley had spilled a full glass of red wine on the white duvet cover and driven to town himself at 10 o'clock at night to find stain remover. Shepard's email said, "The Hartley reservation. Can you confirm what we usually charge them? I'm seeing 2 different rate codes in the system." Sloane looked at the email for a moment, then she looked around her kitchen. Then she wrote back, "The Hartley's book at the pre-peak autumn rate. They've been guests for 12 years. They don't register as a peak holiday booking unless you've changed the rate calendar." Shepard wrote back 40 minutes later, "We updated the calendar last month. Veterans Day weekend is now peak pricing." Sloane put her phone face down on the table. She sat with it for a while. Then she picked it up and wrote, "Veterans Day has never been a peak weekend at any of these properties. The Hartleys are not a transaction. Give them the rate they've always had." Shepard did not respond that day. The inspection report from Hugh arrived on a Saturday, printed and mailed with a cover page that said Callahan Cleft Cabin Assessment at the top in a font he'd clearly chosen for legibility rather than aesthetics. Sloane spread it on her kitchen table and worked through it with a yellow highlighter, marking everything that had to happen before winter on one reading and everything that could wait until spring on another. The total, even using conservative estimates, was enough to make her set the pencil down and breathe through her nose for a moment. She crossed out the floor, refinishing. She crossed out new upper kitchen cabinets. She wrote "paint myself" next to the walls. She wrote "wait" next to several other items and tried to determine whether wait meant wait until I have money or wait until I can bear to think about it. Then she picked up Hugh's list of suggested contractors and looked at the last name again, Devlin Reed. She had avoided it for 4 days. She had looked at the other names, called the electrician, who was booking into December, called the furnace company, who could send someone the following week, left a message for the roofer. She had made every other call on the list. She picked up her phone. She dialed before she could decide that tomorrow would be better. 4 rings. Reed. The voice was lower than she remembered. She'd heard it only a few times years ago and from a distance, but some things stayed in the ear. This one had. "Devlin," she said, "this is Sloane Callahan." Silence, the complete kind, the kind that comes when someone is not trying to fill space, but has chosen to let what's been said settle where it lands. "I know who this is," he said. "I thought you might. Most people keep their numbers." "I meant after all this time." "I know what you meant." She heard something in the background, on his end. A television turned, low voices blurring together at the edges. "Hugh Marsh gave me your number," she said. "That sounds like Hugh." He inspected the caretaker cabin at the Cliff property, the one in the cleft. A pause. "That sounds like a worse idea. I'm going to live there. Then it's definitely a worse idea." She almost smiled. The response had come out of him quickly, dry and without effort, and it was the first thing anyone had said to her in 3 weeks that felt like it was addressed to the actual situation rather than to some version of it that was easier to manage. "I need help with repairs," she said. "Smaller work, porch, support, roof patch, some cabinet work, maybe the bathroom sink. Hugh says the major electrical and furnace work needs licensed contractors." "Hugh's right. I thought I'd ask if you'd come look." There was a pause. "Did your brother give you permission?" She felt the heat of it move up through her chest before she decided what to do with it. "I don't need my brother's permission," she said. "Good," Devlin said. "Then maybe this is a real conversation." She looked at the inspection report spread across her table. She looked at the list of crossed-out items and circled items and items she'd marked wait. She thought about what she needed to say and how to say it without it becoming something other than what it was, without letting it collapse into an apology that was really just a way of getting to the end of the discomfort faster. "I should have said something," she said. "That day in the yard, when my father went into the shed with your drawings. I know what day. I know you know." The television sound on his end dropped slightly, like someone had moved away from it. "I was 14, she said. "I didn't have the language for what I was seeing. Or maybe I had it, and I was afraid to use it." She stopped. "That's the more honest version." Devlin was quiet, not filling it, just letting it exist. "I was afraid," she said, of what it would cost me to say it out loud, in that house with my father being my father. She stopped again. I'm not asking you to call that forgivable. I'm just trying to tell you the truth while I still know exactly what it is. Another pause, long enough that she could hear her own heartbeat. That, Devlin said, is an honest answer. She let out a breath she hadn't tracked herself holding. Will you come look at the cabin? She said. What kind of work? She listed it. He listened without interrupting. Saturday, he said, 10 in the morning. Thank you. I'll tell you if I'll take the work after I've seen it. A beat. And I charge for the estimate if it runs past an hour. That's fair. There was a pause before he spoke again. When he did, his voice had shifted slightly, not softer, but lower, like a statement made for accuracy rather than effect. You were the one in the window, he said. Then he hung up. Sloane sat for a long time with the phone in her hand and the inspection report on the table in front of her and the October wind pressing at the kitchen window, and she felt something move through her that she did not have an easy name for. Not relief, not absolution, something more like the feeling of a door being opened in a house you'd stopped expecting to ever go back into. The Hartley situation resolved itself on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Hartley called the main guest line, which now routed to Shepard's phone, and Shepard did not answer because he was in a meeting in Portland. The call rolled to voicemail. Mrs. Hartley left a message pleasant and brief, saying they were looking forward to their visit and did just want to confirm that everything was in order regarding the rate, since the booking confirmation showed a figure different from what they'd been charged in previous years. Shepard called Sloane that afternoon. The Hartleys, he said. I know. The number they're expecting is 32% lower than what we've got them down for. Yes, that's significant. Yes, I told you last week. He was quiet for a moment. Can you call them back? They'd rather hear from you. They'd rather hear from someone who knows them, Sloane said. That used to be me. If you want to keep that relationship, you need to be the one to call them. I'll tell you what to say. She told him what to say. She told him to give them the original rate, to say there had been a calendar error, to not make it complicated, because Mr. and Mrs. Hartley were people who had been generous guests for 12 years and did not deserve to feel like they'd had to fight for something that should never have been changed. Shepard listened. He said he'd think about it. 2 days later, Sloane found out through the confirmation email she still had access to, because no one had thought to remove her yet, that Shepard had given the Hartleys 10% off the new rate, which was still significantly above the old rate, and had marked the difference as a loyalty discount. He had told them in the email that the adjustment reflected how much the Callahan family valued long-term guests. Sloane read the email twice. Then she closed her laptop and went to stand at the kitchen window for a while, looking at the neighbor's maple tree, which had gone entirely orange, which was the only thing happening in her yard at that moment that wasn't quietly infuriating. On the Thursday before the Hartleys were due to arrive, Sloane was at the cabin. She'd been there most of the morning, working through the kitchen drawers, finding the previous occupants of the space, in layers a twist of old aluminum foil, 3 dead batteries, a matchbook from a roadside diner in eastern Oregon that had probably closed 20 years ago. She was crouched by the lower cabinet, replacing a hinge that had pulled halfway out of the wood, when she heard footsteps on the porch. She opened the door before the knock. Mrs. Hartley stood there in a raincoat, the color of a cardinal, holding a paper bag in both hands. She was a small woman in her early 70s, with white hair cut close to her head and the kind of face that showed everything it had ever felt, which was Sloane had always thought the best kind. "I know this might be strange," Mrs. Hartley said. "Shepard told us you'd moved out here. We wanted to see." "I'm not moved yet." Sloane stepped back. "Come in." They sat at the listing table with cups of tea from the camp stove Sloane had brought over while waiting for the gas to be reconnected. Mrs. Hartley looked around at the stripped kitchen, the paint-stripped cabinets leaning against the wall, the tools on the floor, the window that needed new caulk, and the shelf that was slightly less crooked than it had been a week ago. "It has good bones," Mrs. Hartley said. "That's what Hugh said about the walls and the joists. Everything else he was less generous about. Hugh was always thorough." She set the bag on the table between them. "Cherry preserves in a jar with a hand-lettered label. We make these every year. I bring them when I'm visiting someone in a new place because you always need something in the kitchen before everything else arrives." "Thank you." Mrs. Hartley folded her hands around her tea. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want to say it before I lose my nerve because I've been meaning to say it to your family for a year, and I don't know how much longer I'll be making this drive." Sloane watched her. "We came the first year because we found the listing. We came the second year because the house was beautiful." Mrs. Hartley paused. "We came back every year after that because of you." Sloane did not speak. "Your father was lovely," Mrs. Hartley said. "Funny. Good company at the property, welcome. But you were the one who called, before we arrived, to ask about Robert's pillow. You were the one who found the luggage rack the year we forgot to request it and had it set up before we even unpacked. The year my mother died, we were here that fall. You remember you sat with me on the Cliff House porch for almost 2 hours, and you never once looked like you were trying to get somewhere else." She stopped. "I wanted you to know that we know the difference." Sloane looked at the jar of cherry preserves. "And I want to say," Mrs. Hartley continued, her voice careful now, moving over something delicate, "that your father spoke about you every year. Every year when we arrived, the first thing he did was find a way to bring you into the conversation. He said your first year, the very first summer, he said it at breakfast in front of a full dining room." She paused. "He said, she's the one who makes this place work. I just built the buildings." The cabin was very quiet. The wind moved through the gap in the cliffs outside with a sound like distant breathing. "He said that." Sloane's voice came out differently than she'd intended. Something in it was younger than 22. "Every year, some version of it," Mrs. Hartley said. "To us, to other guests. He said it the way people say things they're proud of but don't know how to say directly. You know the way." Sloane did know the way. She had grown up inside it. She looked at the jar on the table. She thought about her father going to a lawyer 3 years ago and signing a piece of paper and putting it in a folder. She thought about all the things he'd said to strangers in a full dining room and had never walked across the hall to say to her. She thought about the difference between those two things and whether it was large or small, or whether it was possible to hold them both in the same hand at the same time without one canceling the other out. She thought about the window, the shed door closing, 8 years of silence that had grown inside her in the particular way of things that are never named. "Thank you," she said to Mrs. Hartley, "for telling me." Mrs. Hartley reached across the table and pressed Sloane's hand once briefly, the way someone does when they've said the important thing and know not to add to it. They finished their tea. After she left, Sloane sat alone in the cabin kitchen for a long time. Through the narrow window above the sink, between the 2 walls of sandstone, she could see the strip of water. Gray today, the Pacific in its October mood, muscular and indifferent and ancient, a color that had no comfortable name. She set the jar of cherry preserves on the shelf. She picked up the piece of paper with Devlin Reed's phone number on it. She had a furnace to replace, a porch support to rebuild, a cabin that leaned 8 degrees to the north because it had decided on its direction and committed to it. She had a great deal of work to do. She was 22 years old, and she had known this coastline her entire life, and she had finally, on a gray October afternoon, in a cabin wedged between 2 walls of stone above the Pacific, stopped waiting for permission to be exactly where she already was. Celeste Vane, from the property 2 headlands down, had left a casserole on Sloane's porch the week before, placed quietly, without knocking, with a note that said, "Only for whenever you need it." Sloane had eaten it over 3 evenings and had not called to thank her yet, and the not calling had become its own small comfort, the understanding that Celeste did not require acknowledgement in the way that most people did, and that this was a quality worth being near. Devlin Reed arrived 9 minutes early on a Saturday morning in a white work van with one rusted rear panel that had been repaired at some point with a slightly different shade of white, so that the whole vehicle had a patched quality, functional and unapologetic. He parked in the gravel lot and stood beside the van for a moment, looking at the headland, at the rosemary hedge and the edge of the cliff and the gap in the sandstone where the path began. Sloane was already there. She'd been there since 7:30, not because there was anything urgent to do, but because the cabin had started to feel like the only place on the property where no one expected anything of her, and she'd been spending more time in it than she would have admitted to either of her brothers. She watched him from the porch as he crossed the lot. He was in his mid-40s, broader through the shoulders than she remembered, though she reminded herself that her memory of him was a 14-year-old's memory seen from behind glass at a distance. He wore clean work pants and a canvas jacket and carried a clipboard with the particular ease of someone who had carried one for a long time. His beard was clipped close. His hair was shorter than she expected. He stopped at the entrance to the path and looked at it. "They cut these steps by hand," he said, not quite to her. "Whoever built the cabin first, I think. They were stubborn. That seems like a prerequisite for living here." He looked at her then. It was a direct look, assessing without being unkind, and it lasted just long enough to be honest. "You go first," he said. "I'll watch the path." She went first. She had walked it 6 times now. She no longer pressed her whole hand against the rock face, only her fingertips lightly, a habit rather than a necessity. The wind was from the south this morning, which meant it came against her back rather than her side, which was marginally more comfortable and entirely less predictable. Below them, the ocean moved in long green swells, the Pacific, on a morning when it had decided to be beautiful rather than threatening, which it did sometimes as a kind of reminder that the beauty and the threat were the same thing in different moods. She heard Devlin behind her. He moved carefully, not cautiously. There was a difference. Carefully meant paying attention. She appreciated it. At the cabin, she unlocked the door. Same shoulder press required. Same smell of cold wood and salt air. Devlin walked through without touching anything, the way Hugh had, the way experienced assessors move through a space before they decided what they thought about it. He was quieter than Hugh. Where Hugh had announced his findings to the room at large, Devlin simply looked, moved on, looked again. He read Hugh's report on his clipboard, grunting twice, in the particular way of someone confirming what they'd already suspected. He crouched beside the fireplace and pressed the plywood panel with one knuckle. He used a small level on the bedroom floor and watched the bubbles settle. He went to the porch platform and crouched again, getting close to the eastern support, to the flat stones beneath it, to the place where the wood had gone soft from years of moisture working up from below. Sloane stood back and let him work. "Your father put the plywood over the fireplace," he said. It was not quite a question. After birds came down the chimney, he told the story differently every time. Devlin made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. He straightened from the porch support and looked at the east corner of the cabin, at the iron posts driven into the bedrock, at the darkness of the crack below. "She's solid where it counts," he said. "That's what Hugh said. Hugh's right about structures. He's wrong about people sometimes, but he's right about structures." He came inside and sat at the table. He divided the repairs into 3 categories on a fresh sheet of paper. Now, before winter, later. He wrote with a ballpoint pen, and the writing slanted severely to the right, the letters angling forward as though they were in a hurry, though the hand that made them was not hurried at all. Sloane sat across from him and read it as it appeared. "Materials at cost," he said. "Labor is what's listed. If I find something that changes the scope, I tell you before I touch it." "Agreed. If someone else gives you instructions about the work while I'm doing it, I ignore them." She looked up. "That's not personal," he said. "You told me that on the phone. I'm saying it in person because in person it sticks better." He tapped the page. "I work for one person at a time. If the scope changes, the conversation is with you. I'll tell my brothers." "No," he said. "I'll tell them if it comes up." He added a line at the bottom of the estimate. She looked at it. "The lamp," she said. He'd written rewire brass floor, lamp cord replacement, and socket inspection. Faye mentioned there was a lamp on its side in the corner. "I can replace a cord without pulling a permit." He capped the pen. "Assuming you want it upright." Sloane looked at the brass floor lamp lying on its side near the north wall. It had been there since she could remember. Her father had taken the shade off it for some reason 15 years ago and never replaced it. He'd put it in the cabin because he didn't know what else to do with a lamp that had lost its shade and whose cord had frayed at the switch. "Yes," she said, "I want it upright." I took the lamp when he left, wrapped in an old moving blanket from the van. He shook her hand at the path entrance, which surprised her slightly. "Monday," he said, "I'll start with the porch support." "Thank you, Devlin." He looked at her steadily for one more moment. Not the assessing look from before, something slightly different, more settled. "I don't know yet if I've forgiven your father," he said. "I thought you should know that going in." "That's fair," she said, "but you're not your father." He turned and walked to the van. Monday came with a clean sky and a wind sharp enough to have an opinion about everything it touched. Devlin arrived at 7:50 with a section of 4x4 posts, a bag of concrete mix, and a level that he moved from surface to surface with the practiced ease of someone for whom precision was not a goal but a habit. Sloane brought coffee from the house. He accepted it without the performance of either gratitude or refusal, just took the mug and set it on a sawhorse while he worked and drank from it at intervals. She watched him dismantle the failing porch support. The post had rotted from the bottom up, moisture working through the stacked stones over years until the wood had given up its pretense of structural integrity and become something more sculptural than functional. Devlin worked methodically. He set a temporary brace before he removed anything, so the platform sagged in a controlled direction rather than an exciting one. He showed her where the problem had started, the gap between the bottom of the post and the topmost stone, where water had found a way in the way water always found a way in. You want this 4 inches lower than the old one, he said. Is that better? It's safer, easier approach from the path, less rise. She looked at the entrance to the path and then at the porch level. From Cliff House, which was visible across the gravel lot, the height difference between a level porch and a lower one would be noticeable. Lower, she said. He nodded once and marked the cut. They were working through the second hour when Brennan's truck came into the lot. Had parked too close to the sawhorses. Devlin didn't look up. Is that yours? Devlin said. My brother's. He parks like your father. Sloan said nothing because it was accurate and because the accuracy landed in a complicated place. Brennan got out. He was carrying a box of something and wearing his tape measure on his belt, and the look he wore when he'd found a problem he thought someone else had caused. He saw Devlin and stopped. He covered the distance between them in a way that was trying not to look fast. What's going on? He said. Porch repair, Sloan said. I can see that. His eyes moved to Devlin and then to her. Can I talk to you alone? We're talking. Alone, Sloan. Devlin stood up from where he'd been measuring, gathered a board from beside the van, and carried it to his work area with the unhurried manner of someone who has given people privacy so many times that it no longer requires any particular arrangement of his face. Brennan waited until the saw started. Then he turned to her. Why is he here? He's repairing the porch. You hired him without telling me. I told Shepard. Shepard thought you were joking. Why would I joke about hiring a contractor? Because you know what happened. Brennan's voice had dropped but not softened. Because Dad fired him for leaving a roof job unfinished. Blue Ridge Sloan the water damage that took 3 months to fix. The saw stopped. Sloan had been waiting for this conversation since the night she'd made the phone call. She had not rehearsed it because she'd found over the years that rehearsed conversations always surprise you somewhere in the middle, and then the rehearsal became a liability. Your father told Devlin to stop working on the Blue Ridge roof, she said. Guests were complaining about the ladder outside their window. He thought the patch would hold overnight. Brennan looked at her, carefully, the way he looked at something structural when he was trying to determine if it was actually as solid as it appeared. That's not what Dad said. No, it isn't. You're saying Dad lied. I'm saying Devlin did what he was told, and your father made a different decision about how to describe that afterward. She kept her voice level. I was there, Brennan. I was 14, and I was in the kitchen, and I saw the whole yard through the window. The silence between them had a particular texture. Why didn't you say anything? Brennan asked. She had expected this question. She had given the honest version of the answer to Devlin on the phone. It was not easier the second time. Because I was 14, she said, and because saying it would have meant contradicting Dad in front of everyone, and because I didn't, she stopped. I was afraid of what it would cost. Cost you. Yes. Brennan rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at Devlin, who was crouching beside the new footing material with his back to them, working with the deliberate absorption of someone who was listening to nothing except the task in front of him. There's more, Sloan said. Brennan looked at her. Your father took Devlin's deck blueprints, the original design drawings Devlin had developed. He kept them. He used them for the Harrow Cottage deck 2 summers later. She paused. And he didn't pay Devlin for his last week of work. Brennan's expression moved through several things quickly. How do you know that? Because I saw him carry the drawings into the equipment shed, and because I went through Dad's payment records when I was setting up the new accounting system 3 years ago. The last check to Devlin Reed was for the week of June 2nd. He worked through June 9th. The sound of the ocean came up from below the cliff, that steady, indifferent breathing. How much? Brennan said. $1,840. That was 8 years ago. 9. Brennan looked at the ground. He had their father's jaw and their father's way of going still when he was processing something that reorganized a thing he thought was settled. I'm paying it, Sloan said. I paid it this morning, separately from the estimate, out of my own account. That's not your debt. It's my decision. Sloan, I was in the window, she said. I'm not in the window anymore. She left him there and went back to the cabin. The thing about the Hartley situation was that it did not resolve cleanly. On the Thursday before their arrival, Sloan was working at the cabin when her phone showed Shepard calling. She let it ring through. He called again. She answered the second call. The Hartleys are asking again about the rate, he said. I know. I gave them a loyalty discount. You gave them 10% off a rate that's 32% higher than what they've always paid. The market has moved, Sloan. I can't hold rates at 2018 levels. Veterans Day has never been a peak weekend on this coast. You invented the premium and then discounted it and called it generosity. A pause. I'm trying to keep them as guests. Then give them the real rate. I already sent the confirmation. She stood at the kitchen window, looking through the salt haze glass at the 2 walls of sandstone and the strip of water between them. The light was doing something particular to the ocean today, breaking on the swells in a way that was almost amber. Shepard, she said, what did you tell them about me? What do you mean when you talked to them? When you explained the rate change, what did you say? A pause, just long enough to be telling. I explained that you used to handle the hospitality side, that you weren't involved in the revenue decisions. Say the rest. I said that you were very generous with guests and that Dad had always preferred to keep the business decisions separate. The amber light on the water. Your father and I set the rates together, Sloan said, every January. At the kitchen table in Cliff House, I had the ledger. We worked through the whole season calendar, and I argued for rate increases, and he argued for them or against them, and we decided together. She stopped. That is what happened, Shepard, for 5 years. I know you were involved. You just told guests I wasn't. I was trying to explain why the rates were changing. You made me smaller, so the conversation would be easier for you to control. She said it without heat, just as a thing that was true. And Mrs. Hartley heard it, and now she's being kind about it because she's a kind person, and that's the only reason you don't know yet what you actually did. Shepard was quiet. I'll be there when the Hartleys arrive, he said finally. I'll handle it. Handle it before they arrive, Sloan said. Call them, not an email, a call. She hung up. She went back to the cabinet hinge she'd been replacing. Outside, Devlin was working on the porch, and the sound of his hammer came through the wall in steady intervals, and she found the rhythm of it grounding in a way she hadn't expected, the way the sound of any purposeful work in a space you're trying to make yours has a settling quality that's difficult to explain but immediately recognizable. The first time Brennan came to the cabin after the conversation in the yard, he came with a box of smoke detectors. He stood on the porch holding it, not quite meeting her eyes with the expression of a man who had decided to do something practical because he could not yet do anything emotional. Hugh recommended these for the cabin, he said. The current ones are 15 years old. She moved aside and let him in. He installed 4 smoke detectors with the intense focus of someone who was refusing to call what he was doing a peace offering. Sloan held the step stool steady when he needed height. They didn't talk much. The work filled the silence adequately. When he was done, he pulled on each detector with his full weight to check the mounting. I talked to Devlin, he said. She waited. I didn't apologize for Dad. He stepped off the stool. I don't know enough yet about all of it to apologize for Dad, but I told him what I knew about the roof situation, that I'd only ever heard one side. Devlin had not mentioned this to Sloan. She registered that without surprise. Devlin Reed had not struck her as someone who reported conversations. How did he take it, she said. He said all right and then asked me to move my truck because I'd parked too close to his work area. Something moved across her face before she could stop it. Brennan looked at her. Was that funny? A little. He looked at the detector he'd just installed, adjusted it 2 degrees, looked again. I didn't know about the blueprints, he said, or the wages. I know. If I'd known, he stopped. I don't know what I would have done. I'm trying to figure out what that means about me. It means you were a kid too, Sloan said. I was 14 when I saw it. You were 22. Neither of us was running the business. You were running it by 17. Not officially. What does officially mean when you're the one doing the work? She had no answer to that. It was possibly the most accurate thing Brennan had said to her in 3 weeks. He picked up the empty box the detectors had come in, folded it once, set it near the door. The new cleaning service missed Blue Ridge again on Tuesday, he said. I know. The guest called the main line. You saw that. I still have access to the voicemail. No one changed it. He looked at her. Is that your way of telling me to change it? It's my way of telling you that your coverage system has a gap you haven't noticed yet. He picked up the box. He went to the door. He put his hand on the frame and looked out at the path and the cliff and the gray water below. The guest complained about the shower, he said. I handled it. I know. You gave them a complimentary night. He turned. How do you know that? Because that's what you do with a clean complaint from a good faith guest. It's in the green binder, page 14. She looked at him. Or it was before you took the binder. He left after that without saying much else, but he paused at the path entrance and turned back. The step is good, he said. The new one, lower, is better. She understood what he meant. Faye Marsh arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a ring of keys in one hand and an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. Faye was in her early 30s, Hugh's niece, and she had been cleaning the Callahan rental properties for 9 years with a thoroughness and a discretion that Sloan had relied on more than she'd ever said out loud. She was a quiet person, not shy. There was a precision to her that shyness didn't account for, but someone who chose her words the way a good carpenter chose materials for fit and function rather than volume. She had been replaced by a regional cleaning service 6 weeks ago. No conversation. An email from Shepard explaining the transition and thanking her for her years of service. The email had been professional and bloodless and had included a link to submit a final invoice. She handed Sloan the Cliff House key. I could have left it on the counter, Faye said. Shepard said too. I'm glad you didn't. I also wanted to say I'm sorry about your father. He could make me furious, Sloan said. He paid on time. Faye's mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. He paid late sometimes. Last 3 months, Sloan said. I know. I found the records. Faye looked at the key in Sloan's hand. The regional service missed Blue Ridge on Tuesday. I know. They missed Cliff House last Thursday too. A single guest complaint made it into the public reviews before Shepard caught it. Sloan did not know that. She filed it. I'm starting my own company, Faye said. She touched the embroidered patch on her jacket, a simple design, clean lettering, a business name Sloane hadn't noticed before. Private homes, smaller accounts, turnovers for people who want them done right. You'll need to price your time properly. I know. And mileage, the coast road adds up. I know that too, Sloane. They sat at the cabin table. Sloane made coffee on the camp stove. Faye produced a legal pad from her bag and worked through numbers while Sloane asked questions about replacement costs and liability and the specific challenge of managing linen turnovers without a central laundry facility. Faye had thought about most of it. For the things she hadn't, she wrote notes rather than arguing. You're good at this, Faye said. I used to do it every January. Faye looked up. Used to? Sloane understood the correction before it arrived. I do it, she said. Present tense. I set rates and review costs and make decisions about vendor relationships. I did it for 5 years, and I'm doing it now. She stopped. I kept using past tense, and I'm trying to stop. Faye held her gaze for a moment. It takes a while, she said, to stop apologizing for taking up the space you already occupy. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. When she left, Sloane stood on the porch and watched her navigate the path with the ease of someone who'd walked difficult terrain before and had long since stopped wasting energy on fear of it. The laundry arrived on a Wednesday morning. 2 black garbage bags placed in front of the cabin door sometime before Sloane woke up, because when she came outside at 7, they were already there, dusted with condensation from the cold night. A handwritten note was tucked under the top of the nearest bag. No signature. Please wash these. We'll pay your rate. She stood over the bags for a long moment. She untied the top of one and looked inside. Rental linens, sheet sets, towels, a duvet cover from Cliff House. Probably 2 full loads, maybe 3. She recognized the laundry by the fold patterns, the way the previous service had stacked them before sealing them in the bags. She tied the bag closed. She went inside and called Faye. I have a question, she said. Business question. She described the bags and the note. What rate did they agree to? Faye asked. They didn't specify. Then they haven't agreed to anything. That's what I thought. Sloane looked at the bags through the window. What would you charge for pickup, wash, dry, fold, and delivery by tomorrow? Faye gave her a number. It was more than twice what the previous laundry service had charged. Can you do it at that rate? Yes, but they won't like it. They don't have to like it, Sloane said. They just have to confirm it. She turned the note over and wrote the number on the back. Under it, she wrote, confirm by noon or collect unwashed. She didn't sign her name. She carried both bags across the gravel lot and placed them under the covered entry at Cliff House. Then she returned to the cabin, locked the door, and went back to what she'd been doing. At 11:43, Faye called back. They confirmed, Faye said. Which one called? Shepard. He argued for 6 minutes and then asked if I could do towels too. And I made him say yes clearly before I said mine. Sloane smiled. Good. The bags were returned Thursday afternoon clean and folded and bundled by size with a neatness that was itself a statement. Faye brought one bundle to the cabin so Sloane could see. You don't have to prove anything to me, Sloane said. I know, Faye said. I'm proving it to myself. They sat at the table for another hour after that, Faye with her legal pad, Sloane with questions she'd been turning over for days about liability and insurance and the particular mathematics of running a business from a van on a coast road that charged $2 a mile in wear on any vehicle that took it seriously. Faye answered the questions she had answers to and wrote down the ones she didn't. She left with a longer legal pad and a shorter list of uncertainties, which was Sloane thought the best you could ask of any working session. The storm that came in the third week of October arrived the way serious storms on the Oregon coast always arrived, with a weather forecast that sounded significant but not extraordinary, and then with a reality that was both. Sloane had been watching it develop since morning. The light went wrong first, that specific bronzy quality the sky gets on the coast when a pressure system is doing something large and organized offshore. Then the wind shifted, coming from the northwest instead of the south, which on this particular headland meant it was hitting the cliff face directly and sending sounds up through the rock that were felt as much as heard. She brought the porch chairs inside the cabin. She tied the garden stake she'd planted near the cliff edge. She filled the water container she kept for power outages because the pump ran on electricity, and she'd learned at 17 that the first thing to go in a coastal storm was often the thing you assumed was most fundamental. Devlin came by in the afternoon to check the porch repair and the roof flashing. He stood in the yard looking at the clouds over the water. He had been on this coast long enough to read the sky the way most people read a clock, not for precise information, but for a general and reliable sense of where things were headed. Going to be bad, he said. How bad? Move your car away from the cliff edge. She moved the car. Across the lot, she could see Brennan and Shepard carrying patio furniture into Cliff House. The rhythms of storm preparation were the same ones she'd grown up with, the same sequence of actions in the same order, and watching her brothers perform them correctly, even if they'd had to figure out the sequence themselves, produced a feeling she couldn't quite name, not pride, not relief, something quieter than either. Devlin left at 4. The power went out at 6:12. The cabin went dark and cold immediately. The furnace clicked off. Outside, the wind had stopped its preliminary performance and committed entirely. It pressed against the windows with a force that was personal, that felt directed the way weather on the coast sometimes crossed from meteorological into something that seemed to require a different vocabulary. Sloane lit 2 candles. She placed one in the kitchen sink in the ceramic basin where it couldn't fall, and left one on the table. She texted Brennan and Shepard power out. All guests accounted for. Brennan replied first. Working on it. Blue Ridge okay. Cliff House fine. Shepard Harrow has 4 guests all inside. She sat in the wooden chair with a book she couldn't quite concentrate on. A branch hit the cabin roof with a dragging sound, heavy and slow, and then slid off. The iron posts in the east corner made a sound they'd never made before, a low metallic resonance, and she held very still until it stopped. She called Devlin. Don't go outside, he said before she'd said anything. I wasn't. You were thinking about it. Don't. The post made a sound. In this wind, everything makes sounds. Is water coming in? No. Then the roof is holding. Stay inside. She stayed inside. At 8:40 something went wrong at Cliff House. She could tell from the sound of it, a crash different from the branch sounds, a heavier crack, something structural, giving way, and she saw the flashlights begin to move. 12 minutes later, someone hammered on her cabin door. It was Shepard. I was soaked entirely through rain dark from his hair to his shoes, and he had come around the long way down the headland path rather than across the open lot, which meant he'd been in the wind at the cliff edge in the dark, and she understood immediately that whatever had happened at Cliff House was significant enough that he hadn't wanted to wait. A limb came down on the back section, he said. It went through the screened porch, not the main structure. Guests. Everyone's inside. No one was near it. He pushed water off his face with his palm. Blue Ridge guests want to leave. The coast road south has a tree down, someone called it in. They're not going anywhere for a while. She looked past him at the dark. Cliff House was a glow of flashlight movement. The sound of the wind in the cleft behind her was enormous, channeled by the two rock faces into something that had no option but to go forward. She stepped back from the door. "Bring them here," she said. Shepard looked at the cabin. She knew what he was seeing. 380 square feet, no power, 2 candles, a camp stove, and a woman who had chosen to live in a crack in a cliff. "You're serious," he said. "They need somewhere out of the wind until the road clears. The cabin is warm enough for bodies in it, and I have a stove." She moved further back. "Living room and kitchen. No one goes into the bedroom or the sewing room." "Okay. You and Brennan manage the guests. I'm not running a hotel." "Understood. And don't call this overflow. These are people in an emergency, and they're guests in my home." He was already pulling out his phone. They brought 7 people from Blue Ridge and 3 from Harrow. 10 adults variously wet and embarrassed about it, carrying phones with dying batteries, and the expressions of people who had planned a pleasant coastal getaway and were revising their expectations in real time. The cabin was immediately too small and immediately adequate, which is what cabins are for. A woman named Paula had 2 raincoats layered over each other, which had achieved a moderate level of irony. Her partner, whose name was Annalise, carried a bottle of wine she'd rescued from the Blue Ridge kitchen as she was leaving and offered it to Sloane with the specific expression of someone who understood that what they were offering was insufficient but was the only thing they had. "Open it," Sloane said. "There are glasses in the cabinet." Shepard found the camping coffee maker in the storage cabinet under the window. It had been her father's, one of the few things he'd owned that she'd wanted to keep, and stared at it with the expression of a man who understood coffee in the abstract. "You boil water first," Sloane said. "Camp stove is on the left. I know how coffee works. Your father didn't." She said it before she decided to. It landed in the room between them, not cruel, just honest. She watched him absorb it. "No," he said quietly. "He didn't. He made the coffee. He was bad at it the first round and better the second." Brennan arrived at 10:30 with a stack of wool blankets from the Cliff House linen closet, blood running from one knuckle, which he was trying not to draw attention to. Sloane saw it immediately. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding on my floor." This persuaded him. He sat at the table. She cleaned the cut at the bathroom sink and wrapped it with the gauze from her kit, working quickly and without commentary. His hands were cold from the storm and shaking slightly from the cold and from whatever he'd needed to do outside to get the blankets. He looked around at the cabin. 10 people in 380 square feet, 3 candles burning, the smell of camp coffee and wet wool coats, and the specific intimacy of people who have been surprised by something larger than themselves. "You handled this," he said. "It wasn't a question. We're handling it." "The roofing company," Brennan said. "Cliff House. I can't reach anyone on the emergency line. They're all going to voicemail." Sloane reached into the kitchen drawer. She had moved the vendor contacts folder to the cabin 3 weeks before because she needed to reference it, and it had been at Cliff House, and she decided it was more useful where she was. She found the page she wanted. "Harold McBride," she said. "Coastal roofing. The company number goes to voicemail in weather. His personal number is below it. She turned the page toward Brennan. He won't go on a roof tonight, but he'll send someone to secure the interior, and he'll have a crew at first light if you ask before midnight. Brennan looked at the page. Then he looked at her. Is this the vendor folder? Yes. Why is it here? Because I needed it. I took his phone out. He called Harold McBride's personal number. It rang 4 times, and then a real voice answered, and Sloan heard Brennan begin to explain the situation in the practical, specific way he was good at when he knew what he was dealing with. She went to check on the guests. The older man, whose name was Leonard, had been given the wooden chair. Sloan had moved it to the center of the room for him. When she saw how he moved, the particular stiffness of someone whose joints had been negotiating with cold weather for years, he thanked her when she brought him a blanket. I didn't know this place was here, he said. Most people don't. It's the nicest one, she smiled. Don't tell my brothers. Brennan from across the room clearly heard this. He said nothing, but she saw the side of his face, and something on it had shifted. Shepard had moved to the far corner of the cabin with his phone and his notebook, managing the guest situation at Harrow remotely, checking in by text with the couple who had stayed behind. At some point, he'd found the emergency notebook in the kitchen drawer. It was thin and spiral-bound, nothing dramatic about its appearance. He'd opened it looking for a flashlight or a fuse box map and had found instead 5 years of handwritten protocol. He stood with it open in both hands. The first page was dated 5 years ago, October. A note Sloan had written to herself about the Harrow Cottage generator and how to prime it after an extended power outage. The notation was precise, numbered with a small diagram in the margin that showed which valve to open first. Following pages documented a coastal storm in the winter of her first year managing when she'd been 17 and alone in the properties while her father recovered from a minor surgery and her brothers were elsewhere. She had handled 3 separate maintenance issues in 4 days, each one logged with the date, the problem, what she'd done, and what she'd learned for next time. There were entries for the Blue Ridge pipe that had frozen in a cold snap, the Harrow Cottage roof that had developed a slow leak after a wet November, the Cliff House guest who had locked herself out at 2 in the morning because her phone had died and she hadn't written down the code. All of it documented, all of it Sloan's handwriting, the same hand that had been answering their questions for the past 6 weeks. Shepard stood in the candlelight with the notebook open and did not move for a long time. Across the cabin, Sloan was heating a second pot of water on the camp stove, asking Leonard whether he took sugar-finding mugs for people who hadn't known to ask for one. She was not looking at Shepard. She had not seen him find the notebook, but some part of her knew the quality of the silence that had formed in the corner where he stood, because she had been reading the quality of silences in that family for 22 years, and this one was the sound of something being understood too late. He set the notebook on the shelf near the door carefully, like something that required that treatment. Then he went back to helping with the guests and did not mention what he'd read. Sloan noticed him set it down. She said nothing. At some point past midnight, the wind eased, not stopped, eased. The difference between a force at full commitment and a force that has made its main point and is beginning to consider the possibility of eventually concluding. 3 guests chose to leave when the coast road reopened at 12:40. A county crew had cleared the downed tree. The others stayed until morning, which was the sensible choice. Sloan made a second pot of camp coffee and passed cups without asking who wanted one. Leonard was asleep in the wooden chair. Annalise had fallen asleep on the couch with her legs across Paula's lap. Shepard was sitting against the east wall with his eyes open, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone who was still working through something interior. Brennan was washing bowls at the sink, which was something she had not asked him to do and had not expected. She stood beside him and dried. Harold's foreman secured the interior of Cliff House, Brennan said. Coastal roofing crew at 6:30 tomorrow. Good. The Harrow guests are comfortable. I checked in with them at 11. Good. He washed the last bowl, set it in the drying rack, looked at the dark window above the sink. You knew everybody's name, he said. They introduced themselves. You knew what Leonard took in his coffee. He told me. I didn't hear him. You were looking for blankets. He dried his hands on his pants. He turned and looked at the cabin, at the candle stubs, at the sleeping guests, at his brother against the wall, at the space that was 380 square feet and had held 12 people through a storm and had not become what anyone would have predicted. I thought this part was just being nice, he said. What part? All of it. The names, the coffee, knowing what people need before they say it. I thought it was just a personality thing, something you happen to be good at. She waited. I didn't know it was work, he said. I didn't understand that it was something you were doing, on purpose, every time. She leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at her oldest brother. It was work, she said, even when I loved doing it. He nodded. Once. I don't need you to feel guilty for not seeing it when you were young, she said. You were in your 30s. You had your own life. That's allowed. I wasn't young last year. No. The furnace clicked on somewhere in the wall. It had been off for hours, and it was doing its warming up sounds, the metal expanding, the ducts adjusting. Brennan looked at the lamp that Devlin had rewired and returned the previous week. Sloan had found a shade at a thrift store in town, plain cream, nothing remarkable but proportionate, and the lamp stood now in the corner near the wooden chair, upright and properly wired and ready. The power was still out, so it was dark, but it was standing in the right position, and that had its own quality. I thought Dad handled the hard parts, Brennan said. Your father handled many hard parts. But when something went wrong at 2 in the morning, I fixed it, Sloan said. Or I made the call that got it fixed. Or I drove 40 minutes in a storm to do the thing that needed doing, so that by morning there was nothing left for anyone else to see, that anything had gone wrong. Brennan looked at the floor. And I made people feel better while the hard parts were still hard, she said. That's also a skill. It takes something from you every time. I did it for 5 years, and I was good at it, and I was glad to be good at it. She paused. And it was mine. The competence was mine, not Dad's. Mine. Brennan raised his eyes. I know that now, he said. I'm trying to figure out what it means that I didn't know it before. She looked at him. Her oldest brother, 46 years old, sitting in her cabin in the middle of the night with wet clothes and a bandaged hand, trying in the particular, inarticulate way of someone who had not been given many tools for this kind of reckoning, to say that he had gotten something important wrong and that he knew it. She thought about the window. She thought about the shed door closing. She thought about all the different kinds of silence a person could choose over the course of a life, and which ones they could take back and which ones they couldn't. I know, she said. The wind moved through the cleft outside, and the old cabin held around them, leaning its 8 degrees to the north, as it had always leaned, settled into its decision, taking up exactly the space it had always occupied. The morning after the storm, Sloane stood on the cabin porch in the gray 6:30 light and watched the coastal roofing crew move across the back section of Cliff House with the efficient purposefulness of people who had done this specific thing many times and had no illusions about it. They moved in pairs. They called out to each other in the abbreviated language of people who trusted each other's competence and didn't need to perform it. Brennan stood in the lot below with a clipboard and a cup of coffee he'd forgotten to drink. Sloane did not cross the lot. She watched from the porch, and she noticed the watching itself, the fact that she was on this side of the gravel, now that the problem over there was no longer hers to manage, and she tried to determine what she felt about that. It was not entirely clean. 5 years of conditioning did not dissolve overnight. The reflex to cross the lot and stand beside Brennan and tell him which crew member to talk to and what questions to ask was still there, still immediate, still shaped, exactly like helpfulness. She went inside instead. Devlin arrived at 7:15 to check the cabin roof. He found it undamaged, walked the perimeter twice to confirm it, and then went immediately to Harrow Cottage because the porch roof there was losing water onto the damaged eave, and Harold McBride's crew was stretched thin between two properties. He did not ask Sloane whether that was all right. He simply told her what he was doing and went to do it. She appreciated that more than she could have easily explained. She made breakfast, real breakfast eggs and toast on the camp stove, because the power had come back to most of the headland at 5 in the morning, but the cabin was on a separate circuit that was still waiting for the utility crew. She ate at the table with the cabin door open so she could hear the sounds of the lot, the crew, the trucks, the particular back and forth of a repair operation in its early stages without being inside them. Paula came by to collect her raincoat, which had been left draped over a chair when she'd gone across to Blue Ridge with the other guests after midnight. "I repaired the hem," Sloane said, handing it over. Paula looked at the seam. "When did you do this?" "This morning. You'd caught it on something the stitching pulled out about 4 inches. It would have gotten worse." Paula held the coat and looked at Sloane with an expression that was trying to identify something. "Do you always do that?" Paula said. "Just fix things without being asked." "Usually." "Is that a gift or a burden?" Sloane thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. "Both," she said. "I'm working on the ratio." Paula laughed, bright and genuine. She hugged Sloane briefly and walked back toward the lot with the coat over her arm. Sloane closed the cabin door and stood in the kitchen for a moment. On the small stack of business cards, Faye had helped her print the original draft, had read Sloane Callahan a little upholstery and textile repair work. She found the cards on the shelf, took a pen, and crossed out the words a little. Then she wrote the corrected version on a fresh card: Sloane Callahan Upholstery, Repair and Textile Restoration. She set it on the shelf above the sink where the light from the window would fall on it when the weather cleared. The vendor folder came next. She had moved it to the cabin 3 weeks before the storm, which had turned out to matter more than she'd anticipated when she moved it. Now she needed to decide what to do with the information inside it. The folder contained 12 years of relationships, of specific knowledge about specific people, of the kind of accumulated context that cannot be reconstructed from records, because most of it was never recorded anywhere. Which contractor called back on Sundays? Which supplier extended net 30 terms without making an issue of a week's delay? Which pest control service understood that the Cliff House deck was a known nesting site for a pair of osprey every April and adjusted their schedule accordingly. She sat at the table on a Tuesday morning with the folder open and wrote for 3 hours. Not for Brennan, not for Shepard, for herself first, because writing it down was a way of knowing what she knew, of giving it edges and weight, of making it real, in a way that things known only in the mind are not fully real. She'd been doing this for 5 years, carrying information in her head, the way you carry water in cupped hands, always slightly afraid of what would spill if you weren't paying attention. She wrote it down now, and what she wrote was thorough and precise, and showed in its organization and its detail that it had been built by someone who understood the work not as a set of tasks, but as a set of relationships with their own histories and their own requirements. At noon, she sent a message to Brennan. The vendor contacts are in the folder. I've added notes for each one. The folder is in the cabin. You can have a copy when you're ready. He replied 20 minutes later. Thank you. Can I come by tomorrow morning? She wrote back, call first. 3 minutes passed. Then his message came, can I come by tomorrow morning? She wrote yes, 9 o'clock. I came at 9:02. She poured coffee. She went through the folder with him for 90 minutes, explaining each contact, the history, the specific knowledge that made each relationship functional rather than merely transactional. He took notes. When he had a question, he asked it directly, and without the defensive framing he'd been using for weeks. She answered directly. When she reached the end of what she intended to share in that session, she closed the folder. There's more, she said. I'll put together a second document about the seasonal protocols. That'll take me a few days. How much? Brennan said. She looked at him. Your rate, he said. 35 an hour. How many hours? 4, she said. Maybe 5. He nodded. He took out his checkbook. She watched him write a check for $140, which was 4 hours, which was his decision about the number, and she let it stand because it was close enough and because the act of writing the check was more important than the precise amount. Shepard should be here for the seasonal protocol session, she said. I'll tell him. Not suggest. Tell. The corner of his mouth moved. I'll tell him. Shepard's Thursday visits began by accident. He came the first Thursday to ask about the Hartley guest notes, which were in the card box, which was now in the cabin, which meant he had to knock on the cabin door and ask to come in and look through the box himself, because Sloan had declined to read them to him over the phone. He came in. He found the cards. He stayed for 40 minutes. The second Thursday, he came with a question about the Blue Ridge drainage issue and a bag of groceries that he set on the counter without explaining. He stayed for an hour. The third Thursday, he had no particular question. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon, knocked, waited, came in. When she opened the door, sat at the table, and opened his laptop. He worked on something, and she worked on something, and they shared the table and the quiet for almost 2 hours before he said anything that wasn't practical. What he said was, I've been thinking about the Hartley situation. Sloan set down her needle. She was working on a chair cushion, a repair job for a woman in Astoria who'd found her through Celeste Vane, who had apparently been mentioning Sloan's name to everyone she met in a 30-mile radius, with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had decided this was a cause worth backing. What about it? Sloan said. I told them something that wasn't true, Shepard said. Not exactly a lie, but I shaped what I said to make the conversation easier for me, and it came at your expense, and they believed me because they had no reason not to. He looked at his laptop screen, not at her. And you found out because Mrs. Hartley told you, which means she told you what I'd said because she trusted you enough to be honest about it. and I used your trustworthiness to cover my own dishonesty." He closed the laptop. "I've been going around with that for a while." "Yes," Sloane said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. He was looking at her now, directly, with the particular expression of someone who has prepared to say a hard thing and has said it and is now waiting to see whether it was enough. "I know you are," she said. "Is that the end of it?" "That depends on what you do next time you're explaining a rate change to a long-term guest, and you're tempted to use me as the explanation." He was quiet. "The right thing to say," Sloane said, "is that the business is under new management, and the new management is still calibrating. That's true, and it doesn't require throwing anyone under anything." She went back to the cushion. "It also happens to invite the guests into a conversation rather than closing them out of one, which is the whole point of the kind of hospitality this family has always tried to offer." Shepard looked at the chair she was sewing. He looked at the card box on the shelf. He looked at the yellow cabinets that she had stripped and painted in the weeks before the storm, the warm golden straw that everyone called mustard, and that was in fact something more considered than that, and the lamp upright in the corner with its plain cream shade. "Dad used to say you had good instincts," he said. "Dad said it to the guests. It took me a long time to understand he meant it. I wasn't good at saying things directly." "No, neither am I." "You're getting better," Sloane said. "That's worth something." He opened his laptop again. They worked for another hour. When he left, he washed his mug in the sink without being asked. The map arrived on a Saturday morning in early November. She heard them on the path, the two sets of footsteps she'd learned to distinguish, Brennan's heavier and more deliberate, Shepard's slightly quicker, and she understood from the sound of them that they'd walked together, that this was coordinated, which meant it was something they'd decided required a unified presentation. She opened the door before they knocked. Brennan was carrying a rolled paper under his arm. They came in. Brennan unrolled the map on the kitchen table and held the corners down with his hands while Shepard stood on the other side. It was a site plan of the property, precise and professionally drawn, the kind you got from a surveyor rather than printed from a computer. It showed all 4 properties: Cliff House, Blue Ridge, Harrow Cottage, the Crestwood rental, the gravel lot, the equipment shed, the path to the cleft, and the cabin itself. There was a shaded rectangle on the map. It overlapped the eastern edge of the small patch of ground beside the cabin where Sloane had, over the preceding weeks, planted a row of garlic, 3 tomato plants in pots, late-blooming chrysanthemums along the rock face, and installed a rusted garden gate she'd found at an estate sale in Tillamook. The gate opened onto the same ground it stood in, being attached to no fence, serving no functional purpose, and being entirely satisfying to look at. "What's the rectangle?" she said. "Overflow parking," Shepard said. "Peak weekends, 6 to 8 spaces." She looked at the shaded area. It consumed most of what she'd planted and would require removing the gate. "For the rentals," she said. "Guests are coming with more vehicles than they register," Brennan said. "We can't put them on the road. The county's issued 2 courtesy notices. The gravel lot doesn't expand without going into the equipment shed or this strip." "The equipment shed is load-bearing storage," Sloane said. "Right. So this strip is the only practical expansion." She looked at the map. She looked at the rectangle. "That's my yard," she said. "We know," Brennan said. "We're not asking for free use. We'd compensate." "What's the compensation for sleeping without the sound of car doors at 11 at night?" Neither of them answered. She rolled the map from her end. Brennan put his hands down from the corners, and the paper curled up between them. "No," she said. Shepard leaned against the counter. This affects all 3 rentals. If we can't manage parking on peak weekends, we're going to start seeing it in the reviews, and reviews affect. I know what reviews affect, Sloan said. I built the review management system. I know exactly how many words in a negative review are about parking versus about the property itself. And I know that the guests who complain about parking are the same guests who complain about the access path and the sound of the ocean. They're looking for a hotel. You can't solve a category problem with a parking space. Silence. You want more space, she said. Sell Crestwood. Both brothers looked at her. It costs the most to maintain and brings in the least per booking, she said. That's been true for 3 years. The roof alone has had 2 significant repairs in 4 seasons. The foundation issue comes back every 3rd winter, regardless of what you do to it. Your father held on to it because he bought it first and he didn't like acknowledging mistakes. She looked at them both. You're not Dad. You don't have to hold on to it because he did. Brennan picked up the rolled map. He held it at his side. You're not negotiating, he said. I'm not negotiating my yard. He looked at Shepard. Shepard looked at the gate through the window, the rusted one that opened onto nothing, and had been standing at the property's eastern edge for 3 weeks now, getting rained on and developing a fine surface patina and serving no functional purpose that either of them could identify. What is that gate for? Shepard said. It's mine, Sloan said. It doesn't connect to anything. Not everything has to connect to something. They left without saying much else. Not angry exactly, but subdued in the particular way of people who had come prepared for a different conversation and had found themselves in a different one entirely. She watched them cross the lot, both of them steering instinctively around the tomato pots she'd lined along the cabin's east wall. Brennan turned once at the lot's edge. He looked at the gate. He didn't say anything. He kept walking. The decision about Crestwood took 3 weeks. Sloan was not involved. She knew this because neither brother consulted her and because the conversations she happened to hear through open windows during her walks across the property had the particular rhythm of 2 people working through a problem they hadn't finished disagreeing about. Brennan said, maybe then later, then eventually a form of agreement that still sounded like reluctance. Shepard said yes, had been saying yes, and was running out of ways to say it without the word becoming aggressive. The listing went up in the 3rd week of November. Sloan found out from Faye, who had been doing the Crestwood turnovers, and needed to know the expected vacancy timeline. She called Shepard. You're selling Crestwood, she said. Yes. Good. A pause. That's all. I think it's the right call. The financials support it. I said so in October. You weren't supposed to be consulted about it. I'm not consulting. I'm agreeing. She waited a beat. It's a different thing. I exhaled. Dad would have hated it. Your father loved that property because it came first, not because it was the best. Those aren't the same reason. She looked out the window at the ocean, which today was doing something extraordinary, with the winter light going silver at the horizon and green closer in the gradient, so precise it looked designed. He also held on to things past their usefulness because he'd told too many people how much he valued them. Some of the things Dad felt strongly about were feelings, not facts. A long pause. I haven't said that out loud before, Shepard said. I know. It feels disloyal. It feels true, Sloan said. You can be both. Crestwood sold in early December to a family from Eugene who intended to live there, which meant it would stop being a rental property and start being something else, which was its own form of correction. The sale price was fair, not spectacular, but fare was sufficient for what they needed it to do. After fees and the repairs that had been required to bring it to listing condition, the remaining amount stabilized the operating reserve for Cliff House Blue Ridge and Harrow Cottage, and gave both brothers room to breathe without holding their breath. Faye's company took over all three turnovers the week after closing. She made Brennan sign a service agreement at the cabin table on a Tuesday afternoon. Sloan was sewing in the corner and did not participate in the negotiation except once when Brennan began to question the holiday surcharge, and Sloan said, without looking up from her work, "Do you want to clean toilets on Christmas, Brennan?" And Brennan signed the line. Shepard sent Sloan a photo of the signed agreement with a single-word message, "Finally." She did not reply for an hour. Then she sent back, "Good." Patrice Holloway arrived for her training session on a Thursday in early December. She was a woman in her early 50s who had spent 22 years managing guest relations for a hotel group in Portland before deciding, for reasons she described as personal and didn't elaborate on, that she wanted smaller scale and more direct accountability. She had short silver hair and a posture that suggested someone who had spent years standing at the front of rooms and had decided to carry that quality into every situation, regardless of whether a room was involved. She sat across from Sloan at the cabin table with a legal pad and a pen and an expression of total attention that was one of the more reassuring things Sloan had encountered in recent months. They worked for 6 hours. Sloan went through the guest history card by card for the returning guests, the specific knowledge that made each relationship real rather than transactional. She explained the vendor relationships. She explained the property's individual quirks, the ones that weren't in any written record because they'd never needed to be written down when they lived in one person's head. The Blue Ridge hot water lag, the Cliff House northwest window that rattled at specific wind speeds but was structurally fine, the Harrow Cottage outdoor shower that had a 30-second delay before the temperature stabilized and that every single guest would turn to cold by mistake if they weren't warned in advance. Patrice took notes, real notes, the kind that captured not just the information, but the context around it. When she had questions, they were specific. When she didn't understand something, she said so plainly, rather than nodding and hoping to reconstruct it later. She never once called anything a little detail. At the end of the 6th hour, they sat with cold coffee and the card box between them, and Patrice looked at the records Sloan had assembled over 5 years with the expression of someone who was seeing a thing clearly and wanted to say so. "I've done this work for a long time," Patrice said. "I've worked with properties that had much larger teams than this. I've seen professional guest management systems that cost more per year than your family's entire operating reserve." She tapped the card box. "I've never seen records this clean or this complete. Not at this scale." Sloan looked at the box. "Whoever built this system," Patrice said, "built it with the understanding that people aren't transactions. Every note in here is about a specific person's specific situation. That's not a system, that's a philosophy." "I started the cards when I was 17, Sloan said. "I know." Patrice had read every one of them. "It shows." Sloan did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the window, at the strip of water between the two walls of rock gray today, with a white edge where the wind was touching it. "I'm going to tell you something," Patrice said. "I'll tell your brothers too, because they should know it. But I'm telling you first, because it started with you. Okay. This operation runs because of these." She touched the box, then the binder, then the folder. Not the buildings, not the booking platform, not the rate calendar. This, the relationship infrastructure, whatever you want to call it. She looked at Sloane directly. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, and if you hear them starting to correct them. Sloane thought about the dining table in October, the 3 yellow folders and the 1 thin envelope, the way Brennan's pen had gone still. I'm working on it, she said. Patrice nodded once with finality. She closed her legal pad. She stood and put on her coat. Monday, she said. I'll start taking the evening calls. You'll have the first week's call log by Friday. Thank you, Patrice. Thank me in 6 months if the reviews hold. She left. Sloane heard her footsteps on the path, careful and unhurried, and then the sound of her car starting in the lot. That evening she received a message from Shepard. Patrice told me about the records today. She said in 22 years she'd never seen anything like the system you built. I told her you built it when you were 17 and had been running it since then. She said she knew. She could tell by the way it was organized around the guests instead of around the business. A pause in the thread. Then I should have known too. I'm sorry it took someone else to tell me. Sloane read the message twice. She set the phone on the table. She looked at the cabinet doors painted with the color everyone had called mustard, and that was in fact a warm, considered, deliberate golden straw that she had chosen herself and applied herself and had looked at every day since without regret. She opened the sewing machine, her grandmother's, a machine that weighed enough to be geologically significant and that she had carried across the cliff path in 3 separate trips, taking the bobbin assembly and the motor and the cabinet separately because the combined weight was a structural risk on a path 45 centimeters wide, and she had made the trips at different times of day in different weather conditions and had not dropped anything. She threaded it. She turned on the lamp in the corner, the one that was upright now and properly wired, and throwing a warm circle of light across the chair and across the floor and across the yellow cabinets and across the shelf where the jar of cherry preserves sat between 2 blue plates. She did not reply to Shepard's message that night. She replied in the morning briefly, "Thank you, it was enough." Warren Callahan's Memorial Day fell on a Saturday in December 1 year to the date. Sloane woke before 5 and lay in the cabin bed, listening to the sounds the building made in the early morning, the particular inventory of settling and breathing that she had learned over the preceding weeks, the way you learn the sounds of any living thing you live alongside. The refrigerator's hum, which was slightly too loud, and which she had accepted as a permanent characteristic rather than a fault. The ductwork clicking as the furnace started. The specific cadence of the waves in the cleft below, different at low tide and high tide, different in calm and in weather, different in the small hours from the way it was at noon. She had learned all of these things. They were hers now. She got up and made coffee and sat in the wooden chair with the mug and the quiet. On the shelf above the sink, between 2 blue plates she'd brought from the main house and a jar of Hartley cherry preserves, was a single red wool sock. She'd found it in the bottom drawer of the dresser at Cliff House when she was clearing the last of her father's things. One sock, no mate. Her father had accused the dryer of consuming socks for 30 years and had refused to accept any other explanation. She had found 17 mismatched socks in the bottom of that drawer, all of them waiting for their pairs, all of them waiting with the patient absurdity of things that believed the situation would eventually correct itself. She'd kept one, The red one. She wasn't entirely sure why, only that her hand had refused to release it when every other choice that day had felt permanent. She carried her coffee and the sock outside to the porch in the pre-dawn dark. The Pacific was running a long, low swell this morning, the kind that came from far offshore and arrived without drama, rising and folding and pulling back in a rhythm so steady it had the quality of breathing. The sky above the cleft was just beginning to suggest itself in the east, a faint differentiation between cloud and dark that would take another hour to become anything you could call light. She dug a small hole in the garden patch beside the garlic row at the base of the first chrysanthemum. The ground was cold and slightly resistant and smelled of itself, of soil and salt, and the particular minerality that came from being this close to the rock. She put the sock in the hole and covered it, not because it was the right thing to do with a sock, not because it would accomplish anything visible or measurable, but because wool feeds soil better than a drawer does, and because the act of putting something in the ground that has been held too long is its own kind of completion, and because the garlic would be better for it in the spring, and because her father had loved this coast and had never managed to say directly why, and this was the closest she could come to giving something back to the ground he'd spent 28 years making something out of. She stood for a moment in the dark with the wind off the water and the sound of the swell. Then she went inside and began making breakfast for whoever was coming. Patrice was on the guest line that morning. This was the correct arrangement, and everyone who understood how the operation now worked understood it to be so. She would handle whatever came and log it and send Sloan the call report on Friday. The rentals were in capable hands. This freed everyone else to be somewhere else. They knocked at noon, both of them. She heard the footsteps on the path, the same paired rhythm she'd learned to identify, and she heard them stop at the cabin door, and then she heard the knock, clean and deliberate. Not the knock of someone who expects immediate entry, the knock of someone who is waiting to be invited. She opened the door. Brennan stood slightly closer to the door, which told her he'd made himself knock rather than try the handle, which was progress of the specific and effortful kind. He was holding a cast iron skillet that she recognized immediately as her father's, the large one that had lived on the stove at Cliff House for as long as she could remember. She looked at the skillet. She looked at Brennan. "I thought I'd make breakfast," he said. "I cleaned it first." She looked more closely at the skillet. "You soaked it," she said, "just for a little while. Cast iron doesn't get soaked." "I know. I forgot in the moment. Dad would haunt you. I know that too." Shepard was standing behind Brennan with a bakery box and a bottle of wine that he was either bringing for grief or for lunch, possibly both, which Sloan felt was an appropriate attitude toward the day. He had the look of someone who had been up for a while, which she recognized because she'd had it herself most mornings since October. "Can we come in?" Brennan said. She looked at them, her two brothers standing on the porch of the cabin she'd walked through a storm to choose, holding a damaged skillet and a bakery box and a bottle of wine, and the expressions of men who had spent a year learning something they should have started learning sooner and had decided that showing up was the beginning of the rest of it. "Yes," she said, "but next time call first." "I left my phone in the truck," Brennan said. "That's not what call first means." "I know." She stepped back and let them in. The cabin filled differently than it had during the storm. Then it had been emergency density bodies and worry and the specific closeness of people in a situation larger than any of them. Now it was the other kind, the slow warmth of people in a space that had been chosen, filling it at the rate that a cold room fills, with heat gradually, completely, in all its corners. Brennan put the skillet on the stove and looked at it. He looked at the camp stove and then the regular burners, now connected and fully functional, and made the assessment that he was going to have to re-season the pan before he did anything else with it. He asked Sloane where she kept the oil. She told him. He got it out and began working. Shepard sat at the table and opened the wine. He found 2 glasses in the cabinet, examined them, found a third, and poured 3. He placed one near Sloane without fanfare. "The Hartleys wrote a review," he said. "I saw it. They mentioned you by name. I know. You're not on the property anymore. They wrote about a memory," she said. "People review memories as often as they review thread counts." He nodded. He looked at the strip of water through the window, the Pacific in its December state, cold and absolute and running a color she'd never been able to name exactly, somewhere between pewter and slate, and something else that was neither. "I'm sorry about the rates," he said, "and about what I told them. I know. I'm not going to keep apologizing for it. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying it once more, and then I'm going to figure out how to do better, because doing better is more useful than apologizing." She looked at him. He was looking at his glass. "That," she said, "is the most useful thing you've said to me since September." He almost smiled. Celeste Vane arrived at 1 o'clock with a container of soup and a quilt and the announcement that she had been prepared for either grief or hunger and had erred on the side of both. She surveyed the cabin, which she'd been in many times by now, and made the sound she made when she approved of something but didn't want to be sentimental about it. She set the soup on the counter, draped the quilt over the wooden chair, because the cabin ran cold if the door opened frequently, and sat herself at the table with a glass of wine like someone who had been invited specifically. Faye arrived at 1:30 with fresh bread and her scheduling book, which she set aside immediately when she understood the occasion, because Faye understood occasions. Devlin came last. He arrived at 2 with a porch chair that Sloane had left with him several weeks ago for a repair she'd mentioned in passing, a split in the rear leg joint, and had not formally asked him to fix. He set it on the porch without explanation, came inside, and accepted coffee from Shepard, who had figured out the regular coffee maker by this point and was visibly pleased about it. Brennan watched Devlin cross the cabin to the counter. It was the first time they'd been in the same space since the conversation in the yard, and Brennan carried it visibly, the particular awareness of someone who has said something true to a person they'd wronged and is now in the same room with that person and doesn't know yet what the ledger looks like. Devlin poured his coffee. He looked at the skillet on the stove. "You cooking with that," he said to Brennan, "once it's re-seasoned. You soaked it." "How can everyone tell?" "The color," Devlin said, "and the way you're looking at it like it accused you of something." Something shifted in Brennan's expression. The weight of the awareness lightened slightly by the ordinary specificity of the criticism. "I can season it," Devlin said. "I know how." "I know how," Brennan said. "You also know how to park a truck technically." Brennan looked at him. "That was a joke," Devlin said. "Approximately." The corner of Brennan's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the absence of the thing that had been there, the stiffness, the weight of the unaddressed thing, and the absence was its own information. "I told Sloane," Brennan said quietly, "what I should have said to you about what happened." "I know," Devlin said. "I'm sorry for what my father did." Devlin held his coffee with both hands. He looked at Brennan with the direct, unhurried attention he brought to structural assessments. I heard you, he said. Then he moved toward the window because there was apparently nothing more to add, and Devlin Reed did not add to things that were complete. Sloane, who had been in the kitchen while this exchange happened, turned around and set a jar of cherry preserves on the table. Mrs. Hartley, she said to no one in particular. Celeste reached for it immediately. They ate around the table, which held more people than it had been designed to hold, and managed it the way small tables always manage it, when people are willing to be in each other's space without making it an issue. Brennan had re-seasoned the skillet and made eggs with a concentration that suggested he was aware he was being watched and was going to do it correctly, regardless. He was not a natural cook, but he was methodical, and in cooking, as in most things, methodology compensated for instinct more than people generally acknowledge. Shepard washed dishes as they accumulated, which Sloane had not seen him do voluntarily before. He did it badly at first, and then better, which was also, she thought, characteristic. Devlin fixed the cabinet hinge that had been slightly misaligned since Sloane had reinstalled the doors herself in October. He found the screwdriver in the drawer without asking where it was, which meant he had been paying attention to where things were, which was one of the things you did when a space was becoming familiar rather than just visited. Celeste fell asleep in the wooden chair at some point after 3 o'clock and denied it categorically when she woke at 3:40. Faye sat with her scheduling book eventually, not because she was working, but because she was the kind of person who was most comfortable when she had something in her hands, and a scheduling book was what she had. The afternoon light came through the north window and did what it always did in December at this latitude, arrived low and golden, and at an angle that made everything it touched look considered. The yellow cabinets, the lamp in the corner with its plain cream shade throwing its warm circle across the floor, the 2 blue plates on the shelf, the jar of cherry preserves open now passed around the table. Sloane sat with her wine and watched the people in her cabin and did not try to make the moment into something it wasn't. It was an ordinary afternoon with people she had chosen to be near in a space she had chosen and made on a day that was both sad and not sad, in the way that all significant days eventually become both things at once. Her father had not been a simple man. He had been generous and stubborn and sometimes unfair, and had loved this coast with the inarticulate ferocity of someone who didn't have the vocabulary for what it meant to him. He had said things to strangers he should have said to her. He had signed a piece of paper in a lawyer's office and put it in a folder and left her to find it after he was gone. She thought he had probably loved her in the fullest way he knew how, and that the fullest way he knew how had not been sufficient, and that both of those things could be true at the same time and could exist together without requiring her to choose between them. The sock was in the ground. The garlic would come up in spring. Brennan came out to the porch at 5 when the light had gone to its late afternoon gray and the ocean below the cleft was running dark. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. He was looking at the gate, the rusted one she'd installed along the eastern edge of the garden, the one that opened onto the same ground. It stood in attached to no fence, connected to nothing. Devlin straightened it, he said. She looked. He was right. The gate hung plumb. Now the hinges oiled, the upright clean and true. Devlin had done it without saying anything about it at some point during the afternoon when no one was specifically watching. He does that, she said. Brennan looked at the gate for another moment. Then he looked at the path at the opening in the sandstone, where it began at the ocean 15 meters below the cliff edge. I walked the path, he said, yesterday, on my own. She glanced at him. I wanted to understand it, he said. The whole thing. I've been driving past the opening in the rock for 6 weeks, and I've never gone through it. He paused. It's not easy. No. The first part where it narrows, you've got maybe 18 inches between the wall and the edge. I know. You walked that alone in October, the day of the estate meeting. Yes. He looked at the water. I didn't know that, he said. I thought you'd been out here before. I thought you knew the path. I'd been out as a child, with Dad. I'd never done it alone. He was quiet. You did it anyway, he said. It was the right direction, she said. They stood together for a while. The ocean did what it always did, which was continue, which was the most honest thing it could offer. Below them in the cleft, the last of the afternoon light was doing something with the rock faces, warming the sandstone to a color close to amber, the water between them going from gray to something slightly gold before the dark settled in fully. Thursday, Brennan said. Can I come for dinner? She looked at him. I'll call first, he said. All right, she said. He went inside. She heard the voices from the cabin, Celeste rising above the others, Shepard laughing at something, the sound of Devlin's specific silence, which was its own kind of presence, Faye's quiet question about something in her scheduling book. She stayed on the porch a moment longer. The gate stood at the edge of the garden, straight and oiled and opening onto the same yard it had always opened onto, which was the yard, which was the ground, which was the rock, which was the cliff, which was the ocean below and the sky above, and the two walls of stone that held the cabin in their particular grip and had chosen not to let go. She had chosen it back. She turned and went inside and closed the door against the December cold into the warmth and noise of her own home, where the lamp was on in the corner and the cabinets were the right color and the people inside were people she had not been required to keep but had decided to, which was a different thing, and the difference was everything.